Missouri School of Journalism. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. The Trump administration has dramatically changed the way the U.S. government treats the thousands of people who come here seeking asylum from persecution in their home countries. Now, among those affected by these changes are foreign journalists who have had to flee their home countries because of their work. Like other migrants, these foreign journalists who come here seeking safety are much more likely to wind up being held in prisons or federal detention centers, sometimes for months, while their immigration cases are considered. Now, their cases are also being considered by immigration courts that are much more likely to deny asylum requests than they were even a few years ago. So on this edition of Global Journalist, we'll hear from some experts who have been tracking how the U.S. immigration system treats journalists seeking asylum. First, we're going to hear the stories of two such reporters. And the first is a Cuban journalist named Yariel Valdes Gonzales. He came here seeking asylum protection in March, but has wound up being locked in a local prison in Louisiana. Now, for more on his case, we're going to bring in Michael Lavers in Washington, D.C. He's the international editor of the Washington Blade, which is the oldest LGBT news outlet in the country, and one of several outlets that Yariel wrote for. Michael, welcome.
Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. So this is kind of a strange story. Let's start at the beginning. Tell us just a bit about Yariel Valdes's career in journalism in Cuba.
Right, and thank you for your interest in Yariel's case. Yariel just turned 29 last week. He's from Cuba's Villa Clara province, which is a few hours from Havana. He graduated from a local university in 2014 with a degree in journalism, and his career initially began as a reporter for government outlets, radio and television, and then he started to contribute to local Cuban independent media outlets. And his trouble started in 2016 when he signed a letter against what was described as censorship and harassment of independent media outlets in Cuba. And that's when everything started to go downhill for him. He eventually lost his job with his the government-run media outlets that he was working for at the time. He was harassed. He was kicked out of what is called the Union of Young Communists. It's a branch of the Cuban Communist Party that publishes a newspaper called Juventud Rebelde, and everything just spiraled from there.
Sure. I mean, if I can just stop you, if we can just point out that Cuba obviously is still a communist country. Much of the media there is government media, government propaganda. You know, in the past few years, there have been these small independent news outlets that have grown up, electronic outlets, digital outlets that are providing alternative voices. But obviously, their journalists operate at a high degree of risk. But
absolutely.
I mean, you mentioned that Yariel had signed this petition against censorship of these outlets, against harassment of these journalists. What happens next to him?
Right. He was facing a lot of harassment, a lot of ostracization. He was ostracized among his colleagues in Cuba and started receiving threats, and basically was just really mistreated by, by the government. In August of 28, he was summoned to a meeting after he, I'm losing my voice, after he was accepted into this university program in Colombia. And initially he was unable to leave the country, but he was somehow able to convince the Cuban authorities that he was going to visit his father, who lives in Mexico, in Tijuana. And so he was able to leave the country, and he made his way to Mexico, which is where I met him earlier this year. He started writing for The Blade last fall, and on March 27th, he officially asked for asylum in California.
Okay, so he crosses the border. So he finally makes his way to Mexico, ends up crossing the border from Mexico into California. What happens next? Because he winds up in a local prison in Mississippi. How does he get from Mexico to being in the parish lockup near Shreveport?
I don't claim to understand why U.S. immigration officials do what they do. I just know that when Yariel arrived in Mississippi, he called me and it was a place called Tallahatchie County Correctional Facility. It's in Tutwiler, Mississippi. I had to look it up on a map myself. I had no idea where this was. He was brought there shortly after he crossed into the U.S. through a legal port of entry in Calexico, California, which is in the Imperial Valley, about 2 hours east of San Diego. And a few days later, he was transferred to this privately run county jail in Mississippi. And then on May 3rd, I was at my home here in D.C., and he called me from where he is now, which is the Bossier Parish Medium Security Facility outside of Shreveport, Louisiana, saying that he had been transferred to Louisiana. He was absolutely hysterical. He was confused. He was crying. He had no idea where he was, and described extremely difficult conditions in which he was living, and he remains there to this day.
Okay, so he came to the U.S., he asked for asylum, he's been held basically in local jails since then while his asylum case is being processed. What's the status of that?
His next hearing is scheduled to take place on September 18th, which is a week from yesterday. And our hope is that he's able to be released on parole, and he would be allowed to go to Miami, where he has relatives, his aunt, his uncle. He has members of the community that are willing to support him, and he's hoping to go to Miami so he can continue to pursue his asylum case. And we're all just waiting to see what happens with that. And any day now we could get a phone call saying that he's released and he'll be able to go to Miami. So that's where we stand right now.
Sure. We're looking at 5.5 months in detention, though, for him, for someone who has just asked for safe haven here. The Trump administration has taken a tougher approach with the Cuban government than the Obama administration. It's been very critical of human rights abuses by the Cuban government. We actually have a clip of President Trump speaking in 2017 we're going to listen to.
To the Cuban government, I say, put an end to the abuse of dissidents. Release the political prisoners. Stop jailing innocent people.
Okay, there's got to be some dissonance in U.S. policy here. Here's someone who left and yet ends up in jail. Just talk to us for a second about that.
Yeah, I think we all know the rhetoric that comes out of the White House with regards to journalists here in this country and around the world. So it's, and just the overall issue of human rights as we talk about the Trump administration. So I find it a bit curious, actually, that on one hand, we have the Trump administration criticizing the Cuban government for the way that it treats human rights activists, dissidents, critics of the government, and you could argue journalists who work independently of the government. But on the other hand, we have somebody like Yariel who is fleeing that very persecution and looks to the U.S. to provide him with sanctuary and with the opportunity to live a life free of persecution and fear. And yet he's been in ICE custody for over 5 months. To me, it just really doesn't make any sense. And you would think that he has a very clear-cut case, and you would think logic would tell you that the U.S. would want nothing more than to protect him and to provide sanctuary to him. So it really makes no sense that he's been in custody for this long.
Well, Michael Lavers, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much.
This is Global Journalist. On today's program, we're talking about the new challenges for foreign journalists forced to flee their home countries and who seek asylum in the United States. Up next, we're going to talk about a Mexican journalist who fled that country with his 15-year-old son at the height of the Mexican military's war with drug cartels back in 2008. 11 years later, Emilio Gutierrez's case is still winding its way through the immigration system. Before we hear more, a quick disclosure. Our executive editor, Kathy Kiley, has done advocacy for Emilio through the National Press Club. Now, for more on his case, we're joined from El Paso, Texas, by his lawyer, Eduardo Beckett. Eduardo, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. Let's hear just a little bit about Emilio Gutierrez. He's a guy, he was a small-town newspaper reporter in a town in northern Mexico, not far from El Paso, Texas, way back in 2005. And then, as I mentioned, at this time, the Mexican government was sending the army out to different parts of Mexico to fight drug cartels. Tell us about what happened to Emilio.
So yes, you're correct. So Emilio Gutierrez is a fearless reporter who, after graduating high school, worked as a journalist for over 30 years. And in 2005, when the Mexican government started using military troops to combat drug traffickers, they came to his hometown, Asunción, Chihuahua, and he was working for the Diario of Juarez, and he was a correspondent in Asunción. And the military members went to a hotel and robbed the patrons. And so Emilio thought it was an interesting story, and he did his job. And he basically wrote a story about the military, robbing people. He verified everything through the local mayor. Next thing you know, he's getting phone calls from the military threatening him why he dared to talk about the military in such a disrespectful manner. And they summoned him and they gave him a choice: either you come or we pick you up. And all his problems began from there. They basically put him under surveillance. They censored him. They threatened him. He filed complaints with the National Commission for Human Rights. He also filed a complaint with the state prosecutor's office. He continued to be critical of the military and wrote...
And correct me if I'm wrong, he actually wrote stories about the military threatening him while the military was threatening him not to write stories.
Correct. So his bosses told him, that in Mexico you don't mess with the military because they can make you disappear. And but they supported him, and he wrote stories about the threats that he received. And in 2008, his house was raided, and that was subsequent to being under surveillance, censored, threatened. His house was raided, and they were allegedly looking for drugs and weapons. There was, none of that stuff to be found. And then he got word that they were going to kill him. And so, because he continued to write articles and stuff. So then he had to flee to the United States, entered legally with his son, was detained. He also suffered family separation.
Sure. So this is just to back up for a second. So this is 2008, 2009. He flees with his 15-year-old son. They're held separately for a couple of months then, correct?
Correct. So this would be under the Bush administration. He suffers family separation for about 6 months. And then under the Obama administration, he's released. Then he fights his case. In 2017, he speaks in front of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. He spoke in New York, different universities, and he was critical of the Mexican government. He continued to be a critic, but he also was critical of the immigration policies of the United States because of the way he was treated and how they separated him from his son, how they treated him like a criminal. After he entered legally, he did nothing wrong. I mean, he was doing his job as a reporter, a fearless reporter, and yet he was being basically treated as a criminal here in the United States. 2017, he gives a great speech at the National Press Club. He wins an award. Next thing you know, he loses his case, and he's arrested by Immigration Customs Enforcement, and they almost deport him. And we stopped the deportation.
So he's taken back into custody
continues.
then. So he gives a big speech at the National Press Club where he criticizes U.S. policy, and soon thereafter, I think 2 months later, he's taken back into immigration detention and held for a long period of time, as is his son, who's now a young adult.
Correct. So then he gets back to detention, but along with his son. So you can imagine, his mental state that this is twice he's been detained in prison-like settings, treated like a criminal. But on top of that, his son is with him. And I think that was really, really, it really had an effect on Emilio and his son, to see that, all I did was write a story and I did my job. And here I am, again, detained, but this time with my son. His case continues. And I know I'm missing a lot of stuff. It's just the case is such a large case. So I'm just trying to sum it up. So I appreciate you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so he's held in detention for 9 or 10 months. He's eventually released, and you just bring us up to date. What's the status of that case right now?
So this is the second time he loses his asylum case, and it's up on appeal again. And it also took, Penny, Professor Penny from the Rutgers Law School. She actually filed a lawsuit to help get him out. So it took a federal lawsuit to get him released. So, I mean, our government, the U.S. government and the Mexican government, in a way, is persecuting Emilio Gutierrez. He's got two persecutors, the U.S. government and the Mexican government. And it's taking a team of lawyers and a lot of resources just to get Emilio out. So that's that's what's happening here in the U.S., right? It shouldn't happen. You played a clip about President Trump saying, telling Cuba to respect human rights, respect journalists, and yet he's doing the same thing here in the United States.
Well, Eduardo, we're going to hear a little bit more about this case later in the program. You mentioned Penny Vinitis of the Rutgers Law School. We're going to hear from her more in a moment, but we're just out of time. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
My pleasure.
And a disclosure to our audience as well, we did reach out to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency with questions for this show. We did not receive responses to those. A reminder that you're tuned in to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On today's program, we're talking about the change in reception for foreign journalists who come to the U.S. fleeing persecution in their home countries. If you want more Global Journalist, we're online at globaljournalist.org. We're also on Twitter and Facebook, where we live stream. You can also listen on Spotify or iTunes or even NPR podcasts. Now, for more on this, we're going to bring in two other guests. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Dagmar Thiel. She's the director of Fundamedios USA, a press freedom group that does advocacy for Latin American journalists and Hispanic journalists in the U.S. Dagmar, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And joining us from Newark, New Jersey is Penny Vinitis. She's a law professor and the director of the International Human Rights Clinic at Rutgers Law School. Penny, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have both of you. Penny, if we could just pick up for a moment on on what Eduardo Beckett was saying about the case of Emilio Gutierrez, this Mexican journalist who's been here for 11 years and is still seeking asylum. Eduardo had mentioned that you sued the federal government to help free him from detention. Give us just a little bit of an update on that.
Sure. We filed a lawsuit. It's called a habeas corpus lawsuit, and that's Latin for we have the body, making a case that the U.S. government detained Emilio Gutierrez Soto and his son Oscar because they were exercising their freedom of speech rights. Emilio had been living openly with permission by the U.S. government. He was not in detention for 9 years. And then as soon as he began traveling around the country more frequently and criticizing not only the Mexican government, but also the broken U.S. immigration policies, he was immediately detained. We were able to get
Okay, so he's immediately detained, but could this not just be coincidence? Like, is there actual evidence that that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that the U.S. government was actually being vindictive here?
Absolutely. I was about to say that we uncovered governmental documents that basically had Emilio on, it was essentially called a hit list of people who had to be detained immediately. And this was put into place, this list, just a few weeks after the Trump administration took office. And as one of your previous guests said, the Trump administration has been very, very hostile towards journalists. Even in his campaign before he became president, holding journalists in a cage, talking about journalists being enemies of the state. Really sort of ramping up the rhetoric so that there is, sort of the public has actually, sort of been hostile and violent towards journalists, even in our country.
Well, Penny, if I could just stop you there, because I want to bring in Dagmar Thiel. Dagmar, Emilio Gutierrez has been going through the immigration system for 11 years. He's had a number of setbacks here. Does it make sense that he would still feel threatened in Mexico on the basis of these threats that took place, more than a decade ago? I mean, what's the climate like for journalists there?
Well, definitely. The most dangerous place that is not in war, a country that's not in war, and it's the most dangerous place, is Mexico. This year, 13 journalists have been killed for doing their job. So it's very, very dangerous to be in Mexico. It's the organized crime and the corruption that is threatening journalists while doing their work. So definitely for Emilio, going back to Mexico will be the worst of all the scenarios, because for sure he will just increase the rates of journalists that are being victims of human violations. And for sure, he needs to be granted asylum in the U.S. if he wants to be alive.
Well, Penny Benitez, if I could bring you back in, then when you look at cases like Emilio Gutierrez and Yariel Valdes, part of what's striking is that these journalists, they're being held in detention, in prison for, in Yariel's case, the entire time, essentially, while his case is working its way through the system. Now, we know that the immigration system has changed under the Trump administration. I mean, is what's happening to them, is it just reflective of what's happening to many different migrants here, and that detention is becoming much more frequent while their cases are being heard? Or is there something else at work here?
Well, you're right. I mean, the Trump administration has been very hostile to asylum seekers in violation of international law. What is particularly problematic about journalists is that we have a very rich history of legal precedent dating back to 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that allows journalists to seek asylum in the United States. So even in the past year or so, there have been instances where the U.S. has granted asylum to foreign journalists simply because they really, as Dagmar said and as others said, they face imminent threats of death. Emilio received death threats. That is, there is abundant evidence about that. So what we're seeing is that the administration, the Trump administration, is ignoring U.S. well-settled law, where the facts are very similar to Emilio's case, where journalists actually have been given asylum. So it really makes absolutely no sense, because the law is the law. The immigration judges have to apply precedent, and here they're ignoring precedent, which is very problematic. So they're just sort of making things up as they go along.
Well, let me just pick up on this point for Dagmar Thiel then, because not all of these, I mean, people are still being granted asylum, although the denial rates for all asylum seekers have declined over the past several years. But your organization has tracked some similar cases. There's another Cuban journalist, a guy named Seraphin Moran. Talk to us about his case and what happened to him when he came to the United States.
Well, Seraphin Moran, he worked in Cuba for many years, always talking about the opposition and what's happening with the regime. And he was persecuted, he was in jail, he was harassed.
Again, this is someone, I think he worked for an independent news outlet called Cubanet, which is one of these sort of quasi-tolerated websites.
Yes. And he finally managed to fled from Cuba and enter the U.S. And he was detained in Texas for almost 8 months. During the time his case was analyzed, we got in that moment important support from different organizations, and mainly from a very important lawyer firm that made pro bono work. And I think in all the asylum cases, who are the lawyers and what the legal support the detainee gets, that's one of the most important parts. And nowadays, I have to say, it's very difficult to get lawyers pro bono helping immigration cases. What we face right now is all the studies saying just we are only taking cases of kids and families that are separated. So the system is overwhelmed, and it's very difficult to get people joining the cases. But in Seraphin Moran's case, that was possible. We had great support, and after 8 months in custody in Texas, he was granted asylum for him and for his family. He is now trying to get work as a journalist, but meanwhile also working as a mechanic. So he, as many people in Cuba, they know different kinds of jobs to get along.
And Dagmar, I mean, so he's someone who comes here, I mean, it sounds like he had at least a reasonably good case, which was proven out by the fact that he did win asylum, but he still has to spend 8 months in detention. just waiting while that case is heard. Talk to us just a little bit about, remind our listeners, for Cubans especially, if you came here 3 years ago, you would have been treated quite differently by the U.S. government.
Yes, actually, it was very easy. It was very easy for any Cuban to come and to say, okay, I managed to fled the island and I put a foot in American soil, so now I can claim for asylum. And it was very, very easy. They got immediately the asylum or residence. And now it's harder. The law changed, and probably we can be helped with our other panelists who know better about the law. But it's not easy at all. And many of the Cubans are taken in custody immediately after they cross the border. It's also the case of of another journalist, Jose Ramon Ramirez Pantoja, who crossed the border on May 3rd and is now almost 4 months in custody in California. And it hasn't been easy to get him out there, even being a Cuban.
Well, Dagmar, one of the things that seems to be happening here, correct me if I'm wrong, but for years, I think the U.S. has been viewed as something of a beacon for press freedom. It's also had a fairly open policy to refugees relative to many other countries in the world. How is that changing? How is the international perception changing?
Well, it's not that easy anymore for a journalist, as the official narrative against the press is being very tough. And journalists are being called the enemy, as many other presidents in more authoritarian countries like Correa in Ecuador, Chavez in Venezuela, now Maduro, Evo Morales, and also, Duterte in the Philippines. Many tough presidents, they normally talk very bad about the press and get the impression that the press shouldn't be respected. And that leads to a lot of threats that are having also place here in the U.S. You should remember last year, 5 journalists were killed in Annapolis in the newspaper Gazette, when a person just thought he could claim justice for himself and enter the newspaper with a gun and killed 5 of them. And we're having also now surveillance over journalists and human rights advocates at the border, where they are being second checked when they enter or cross the border, and their phones and their computers are being checked and probably taking information there. They are asked about the caravans that are coming from Central America, and their information is being taken. There's not a respect for the sources anymore, and the Latino journalists
and Dagmar, I'm sorry to have to cut you off, but we're just out of time here. You do paint a very dim picture of the situation, unfortunately, right now. But we're going to have to leave it there for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA Mid-Missouri Public Radio. Many thanks to Eduardo Beckett, Michael Lavers, Dagmar Thiel, and Penny Venetis for joining us. Our assistant producers this week are Charles Dranginis and Samantha Wiegand. Trevor Hook is supervising producer, and Benjamin Brink is visual editor. Takia Thomas is audio engineer. Travis McMillan is director. Our executive editor is Kathy Kiley. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in.